It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind of night where even the animals huddled closer together for warmth. A biting wind howled through the trees surrounding the rural shelter in the Midwest, and the livestock barn creaked and groaned under the weight of fresh snow. Inside the dim structure, a farmhand named Ray was finishing his last rounds. He had done this 100 times, checked the latches, top off the feed, listen for anything unusual. Tonight, he heard it. A soft rustling near the back of the barn, by the feed bins. At first he thought it was raccoons or maybe a stray dog, but when he rounded the corner with a flashlight in hand, what he saw made him freeze in place. There, crouched on the hay-covered floor, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her small frame was barely covered by a worn-out coat that hung on her like a blanket of forgotten warmth. Her hands were cupped and trembling as she scooped handfuls of goat feed, cracked corn and pellets, into her mouth like it was the last meal she'd ever have. Her face was thin, cheeks hollow, smudged with dirt, her eyes wide and filled with terror locked onto his. Ray didn't speak. He didn't want to startle her or make her feel more ashamed than she already looked. For a long moment he just stood there, his breath hanging in the cold air between them. His flashlight lowered slowly as the weight of what he was witnessing settled in his chest like a stone. This wasn't some mischievous kid sneaking snacks. This was hunger, desperation. A child left to survive like an animal. She looked ready to bolt, knees tense and eyes scanning for an exit, feed still clutched in her hands, but she didn't move. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the warmth in his eyes. Whatever it was, it kept her there, frozen in place like the world around her. Ray knelt down slowly, not too close, and set the flashlight on the ground. His voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the wind outside, but he didn't speak to question, to scold, or even to comfort. He just let silence wrap around them, like a blanket neither of them had. That moment, shared between a broken girl and a man who'd once known his own kind of cold, was the beginning of something neither could have expected. The girl became a quiet mystery in the small town. After Ray brought her in from the barn that bitter night, the shelter took her in, gave her a warm bed and food she no longer had to steal. But she barely spoke. She'd sit at the edge of the room, curled into herself, eyes darting like a cornered animal. The townspeople had plenty to say, of course. Some whispered with curiosity, wondering who had let a child slip through the cracks like that. Others shook their heads, muttering about bad parents or kids these days. A few offered clothes, a blanket, or a smile, but no one dared to ask her the one question that truly mattered. Where did you come from? What happened to you? It was easier maybe to keep her at a distance, easier to feed a stranger than to feel her sorrow. Then John came in one day, like he always did, quiet and steady, wearing the same worn boots and weathered coat he'd had for years. He'd lost his wife to cancer 5 winters ago and his only daughter to pneumonia when she was still small enough to ride on his shoulders. He knew grief. He knew silence. And he knew the look of someone who carried hunger that wasn't just in the belly, but in the soul. He didn't approach her like she was a case to be solved. He brought his coffee, sat near her without a word, and waited. The second day, he came again. This time, he brought an apple and placed it gently on the table beside her. She didn't touch it, but her eyes followed it. On the third day, he knelt down slowly so he wasn't towering over her. He looked her straight in the eyes, not like she was fragile, but like she mattered. His voice was low and kind, carrying no demand, just something close to love. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Her lips moved, almost against her will. A whisper escaped, cracked and barely there. "Elena." The name hung in the air like a prayer. It was the first word she had spoken in days, and John didn't push for more. He just smiled gently and nodded as if that one word was enough. And for now it was, because in that small, quiet moment someone had finally seen her. Not as a burden, not as a tragedy, but as a person. And that was the beginning of her voice, finding its way back. Snow whispered against the windows of the community shelter that night, the kind of snow that softens the world into silence. Inside, the long table was crowded with familiar faces, neighbors, wanderers, old souls trying to stay warm. Plates clinked with forks, soft laughter filled the air, and bowls of stew sent steam curling upward like tiny prayers. Elena sat at the end of the table, small and still, her hands folded in her lap. Her plate sat untouched, empty. She didn't reach for the breadbasket, didn't look around, just stared straight ahead, quiet in a room full of motion. No one noticed, or maybe they had stopped noticing. People had grown used to the ghost of a girl who never asked for anything. But John noticed. He watched from across the room, saw how she shivered under her thin sweater, how her eyes flicked toward the food but never dared to linger. Slowly, he stood. Without a word, he walked over and gently shrugged the old coat from his shoulders. It was faded and patched, but thick and warm. He draped it around her like a father would a sleeping child, wrapping her in something more than just fabric, something like belonging. Then he set his tray of food, full, steaming, lovingly prepared, down in front of her. Everyone else paused. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Eyes followed him. "You eat first, daughter," he said, voice low but steady. The word hit her like thunder. "Daughter." She blinked. Slowly, as if afraid to break the moment. She raised her eyes to meet his. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But something in her face, tight and guarded for so long, softened, just for a breath. Her hands reached for the spoon, and she began to eat. Not in desperate gulps like before, but slowly, like she finally believed no one would take it away from her. The room remained quiet for a beat longer, then turned back to its usual rhythms. But nothing was the same. Because in that simple act, in a coat placed on small shoulders and a plate passed without pity, Elena felt something stir that had been buried for a long, long time. Hope. Word of what John did traveled fast in that small town, as things always do. By morning, the story had already taken root in whispers at the diner, behind church pews and across grocery aisles. Some scoffed. "You'll spoil her," they muttered. "She needs discipline, not handouts." Old habits die hard, and hearts can grow stiff in places where survival teaches self-preservation over compassion. But others remembered. They remembered John's daughter, the sweet girl who died young, taken by an illness that came too fast and left too much grief behind. They remembered the years after, how John nearly lost the farm trying to hold on to something worth waking up for. They remembered his wife, buried on the coldest day of the year, and how he stood by her grave, with no one but the wind for company. And suddenly his kindness didn't look like weakness. It looked like courage. It started small. A neighbor showed up the next day with a pair of winter boots, too big but warm and waterproof. No name left, just a note. For the girl. Then a thermos of hot soup appeared at the shelter doorstep, followed by mittens, books, clean clothes. The shelter director said nothing. just smiled quietly each time something new arrived. One teacher from the local school offered to tutor Elena after hours. "She'll catch up," she said. "She just needs someone to believe she can." The librarian set aside children's books, all wrapped in ribbon. "She doesn't have a library card yet," she whispered, "but she will." By the end of the week, it wasn't just Elena who changed. It was the town. Walls that had quietly divided people, between us and them, between those who had and those who had not, began to crack, because John hadn't preached or demanded or scolded. He'd simply seen someone suffering and offered what he had, and somehow, in seeing him do it, others began to see themselves, who they were, and who they could still choose to be. It was the kind of change you couldn't measure in dollars or sermons, but you could feel it in the way people looked each other in the eye a little longer, in the small kindnesses that no longer felt extraordinary but necessary. John lit the first spark, and now, in the quiet corners of the town, a wildfire of kindness began to burn. Spring came slowly that year, as if the earth itself had waited for something to bloom besides the trees. The orchard behind John's farmhouse, once brittle and gray, now shimmered with soft blossoms. Bees hummed through the air, and sunlight spilled across the grass in golden sheets. And there, right in the middle of it all, was Elena, laughing, barefoot, chasing after a lamb with a ribbon tied around its neck. She looked different now, not just better fed, but lighter, brighter. She still had shadows. No child forgets survival overnight, but they no longer defined her. She read every book the librarian gave her, curled under the trees with a pencil in hand, underlining words she didn't yet know. She fed the chickens not because she had to, but because she whispered to them like old friends. John watched from the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, his eyes following her like someone watching a second chance unfold before him. One afternoon, a visitor came by, an old friend from town, curious and kind. "She's thriving," he said, watching Elena race the wind. "But why, John? Why did you take her in? You didn't have to." John smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with memory. He took a long sip from his mug before answering. "Because someone once saved me," he said quietly. "When I had nothing but cold hands and a hungry heart, it was my turn." The friend nodded, moved by something deeper than words. As they turned to go inside, the camera, if there had been one, would have lingered. There, by the front door, hung John's old coat, still dusty, still worn. The same coat he'd wrapped around a shivering girl that snowy night when she was more ghost than child. But now it hung like a monument, not to charity, not to pity, but to love, to the warmth one heart can offer another when it chooses to see, not just need, but worth, not just suffering, but a soul still capable of joy. And as the orchard bloomed and laughter echoed through its branches, it was clear. What had begun as survival had become something far greater. Home.